The BELA Act, a step forward for the transformation of South African schools, or doomed to fail? Let's find out. Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX. If you're new around here, I am Dr. Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh, aka Ubabes Where Current Affairs, and we're glad to have you on board. On this channel, we explore South African politics through interviews and analysis. Now, I have been inundated with messages. Please review the BELA Bill, the BELA Act. What are your thoughts on BELA? So today, I'm going to give you a preliminary analysis of the BELA legislation. You've heard the debates, but what we're going to do, like we always do on this channel, is crystallize it so that you can understand what's at stake and its implications. So what we'll first do is just take a quick look at the history of the particular question of segregation in schools, because I want to focus on this question of desegregation, which is still so important in South Africa. Then we'll look at the actual present and we'll look at the amendments, the law, what is proposed to be changed, especially when it comes to school admission policies, which I think is the most important area of these amendment laws. And then we're going to look at the future. Will there be a court challenge? What are the political implications? So let's start with a brief overview of the history of school segregation in South Africa. Now, we know that a centerpiece of the apartheid system and the apartheid project was the segregation of education. So one of the most important and one of the first acts passed by the apartheid state after 1948 was the Bantu Education Act, an act which effectively segregated race and education via racial categories. Now, this was a centerpiece of Verwoerd's ideology going forward. As someone who was invested in the education system, who eventually became prime minister, he would deepen this form of segregation. So we know that South Africa has a huge problem stemming from apartheid forms of segregation with a divided education system. Now, of course, in the build-up to the democratic era, there were multiple attempts to rethink the education system. By that time, we had Bantustans in place. And so in 1994, there was a massive task. And that task was to reintegrate 13 different education systems back into one single national education system. And this was achieved largely through the Schools Act of 1996, which was a signature piece of legislation passed in the Mandela presidency to try and reform education away from its segregated past. Now, since then, a number of things have happened, but the Basic Education Laws Amendment Act, which has just been signed by the president and become law, although some of its provisions, especially sections, the changes to sections 4 and 5, are held in abeyance for 3 months. But this is basically the most widespread form of education legislation since 1996. So what exactly is going on here? You may have seen a great deal of controversy around this bill. Well, let's talk about those who have particularly been adverse to the bill. It has been opposed by the DA, AfriForum, Solidarity, the Institute of Race Relations, and various other school-related governing bodies who have challenged things before constitutional courts. As my producer Oratile quipped, only Steve Hofmeyr is left in terms of challenging this bill from the ideological perspective. So there is an attempt by those who have always and historically been on the side of keeping schools autonomous, i.e. not allowing the state to intervene in schools, especially to desegregate these schools. There has been a move by those forces who have always supported that to oppose the BELA Bill, which has now become an act. Why are they opposing it, and why is it important? And should we reject this bill based on what they say, or is there actually some merit to some of their arguments? I'll show that in the most part, in my opinion, it's an important law, but there are some serious residual concerns about the implementation, but maybe not the same concerns as those AfriForum, DA, etc. bodies would have. Now, there's an interesting scholar of South African education. There are many, but Crane Sudeen is one of them, former Deputy Vice-Chancellor at the University of Cape Town. And he did the study of whether South African schools have truly desegregated since 1994. And what he showed was interesting. Those schools which were historically reserved for white students in apartheid have actually not desegregated, or in other words, they have not integrated as fast as other schools. So those schools that were reserved for Indian South Africans under apartheid, colored South Africans under apartheid, those schools have actually integrated very well. But it has taken even longer, and in many cases still, those schools that are thought of or were thought of as whites-only schools under apartheid have integrated much slower. So against that backdrop, legislators have tried to institute legislation which prevents the following from happening, which prevents schools from using certain pretexts like religion or language, which are important in and of themselves, but used as a pretext for racial discrimination. So there's nothing inherently wrong with setting a language policy, or even in independent schools, subscribing to a religious policy within the school, for example. However, the problem emerges when the point of that is not to preserve culture or religion, but is actually used as a form of racial segregation. So because you can't articulate racial segregation out loud, you do it via various proxy forms of discrimination. And that's what legislators have tried to avoid with the new amendments to this, what's now called the BELA Act, Amendments to the School Act. So that then lays the ground for us to look at what exactly are these amendments and what is their importance. Now, there are a host of amendments. For example, some of the amendments look at making grade R compulsory. So they deal with the attendance. So you have to attend grade R, and then there is a criminalization of the parents of students who actually don't send their children or their learners to school. So there are heavy penalties on the parents if their children don't attend school. So there are those attempts to change the attendance system in various ways and change which grades are now mandatory. But it's really the changes to Section 5 of the Schools Act, the amendments to that section, which to my mind are the most interesting and controversial, and the ones that we really need to understand, because those are the ones which deal with admissions policies. Sam, I just wanted to interrupt this episode to let you know the 4 ways you can help SMWX. Way number 1, you can invite me to speak at your institution or company. Way number 2, you can advertise on this channel. Way number 3, you can become a member of this channel. The link to the membership is down below. And number 4, you can buy merch, that's books or hoodies. Now let's get back to the episode. All our contact details are in the description box below. There's much tighter language, and I think we actually need to look at the language of the former act and the amended act to understand this. So here's what the former act says. Section 5(1), it says, a public school, this is the one that's been amended, a public school must admit learners and serve their educational requirements without unfairly discriminating in any way. A public school must admit learners and serve their educational requirements without unfairly discriminating in any way. The amended section goes like this. A public school must admit and provide education to learners and must serve their educational requirements for the duration of their school attendance without unfairly discriminating in any way. So what are the key changes? Well, in law, the word must is very important because it imposes an injunction that cannot be ignored. If you use the word may, then you give some discretion and permission. If you use must, you're directing someone to do something and not giving them an option. So we now have 2 musts. The first one said a public school must admit learners, and serve their educational requirements without unfairly discriminating in any way. The new one says a public school must admit and provide education to learners and must serve their educational requirements for the duration of their attendance without unfairly discriminating in any way. So there's an attempt to effectively create even more obligation on schools to avoid discrimination, not only when they admit learners, but throughout their journey within that public school. So it's an attempt to tighten up and ensure that the obligation not to discriminate is even more firmly entrenched in the legislation. Now, this comes against the backdrop of a series of important court cases. And I want to take you through those so that you can truly understand this legislation in its full depth. So what happened from as early as 2010 in a constitutional court case called Ermelo is that there was this tussle between school governing bodies, those bodies like councils which effectively provide oversight over a school and to whom the executive, like the headmaster of a school, is accountable. It usually represents the community, the parents, the students, and there may be some other representation. So the school governing body on the one hand, and the provincial Department of Education or the head of Department of Education. And there was some uncertainty about, when it comes to admissions, about letting people into public schools specifically, who has the final say? Is it the school governing body or is it the government, effectively? And what we saw was a series of battles where the school governing bodies of various schools created admissions policies which were seen by the government in some way as discriminatory. And then the government intervened and said, no, you must let these students in. And that went to court, and then the courts had to resolve these problems. So in the Ermelo case, it was a question of language. There have been other cases, the Rivonia case. There is the FedSAS case, which wasn't necessarily about language, but it was about the school district and where you draw the learners from. Obviously, how you draw that boundary then determines the composition of the school and things like the racial and cultural composition. So that's very important. And OGOD, I believe it was, where religion came into play. And students from different religions in public schools were not allowed into schools based on admissions policies. Now, Ermelo is important because where you have a single medium Afrikaans school, for example, right, and you have English-speaking schools that are around that school, but they are full, which is what happened in Ermelo. And then learners say, well, we can't get into the English-speaking schools, but the only other option in our area is a single medium Afrikaans school. And then that school says, well, we're not going to let you in because you don't speak Afrikaans. You can see how that can have spillover effects into the wider community because it prevents access to education, even when there are schools and public resources available. But because of language admissions policies, students actually can't gain access to education through them. So a series of cases from 2010 all the way up till earlier this decade have basically created the following problem. The government may have intervened too much and unprocedurally, but the admissions policies were also found to be discriminatory. So the Constitutional Court or other courts sent them back to the schools to say, even if the government may have been too quick to intervene, please can you review this discriminatory policy because it doesn't conform with constitutional diktats. And so we've had this lack of clarity. Is it the government or is it the school governing body? So what Section 5 does, which we're now in a position to understand, is it ultimately says that it's the HOD which does make the final decision. So government can look at an admissions policy and it can decide that it is actually discriminatory, and it has to go through various filters. It has to be constitutional, there have to be good reasons for it, etc. But ultimately, government can now make the choice. Now, is that a bad thing? Well, those who think that the state should be smaller will inherently think it's a bad thing. But in the context of South Africa, where we have, as I say, this history of racial discrimination, and where we have a present where language can be used as a form of discrimination, as a proxy for racial discrimination, we need some arbiter. And that arbiter is probably best to be a democratically elected state rather than some appointed private person somewhere. Because this is about the public education system. This is about the system of education that serves all South Africans, a system which all South Africans fund, and therefore there needs to be some constitutional scrutiny over these admissions policies. So that's effectively the nub of this debate and this battle and fight. So while I think it is actually a good thing that there is now firmer control over potentially discriminatory admissions policies, there are some residual concerns which I think we need to take seriously. The first is funding. Because once you say that, for example, a single medium Afrikaans school should make place for non-Afrikaans speakers who happen to be in the area if other schools are full, then immediately there are resources needed to make sure that that student or that learner can actually be taught in a language that they can learn in. So you do impose a certain resource constraint on schools, and we know that our fiscal situation in South Africa is not exactly healthy. So there are questions about exactly the financial burden this might place on the South African state, which is not exactly healthy right now. There are also questions of whether this bill is a bit draconian in terms of the penalties it imposes, like I said, on parents and criminalizing those parents. And I believe equal education has raised some concerns around that. So that's also fair. But I have a different concern when I look through the wording of the legislation. And that is that it feels like this legislation is bending over backwards to accommodate those who are criticizing the bill. So for the head of Department of Education to actually intervene in an admissions policy, which we know is necessary given the history of constitutional litigation around the subject, they have to jump through like 10 different hoops. Originally, the legislation said that the school governing body would submit the admissions policy to the state, which would then look at it and approve it or not approve it. But that was watered down over time after there was an outcry from various quarters. And now, basically, there's this whole elaborate process that an HOD has to go through in order to disconfirm an admissions policy. And my question is, sure, that may increase procedural fairness. But what happens when lots and lots of schools, start submitting these policies? Like, are HODs just going to be running around, going to public hearings, making sure the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, making sure that, they've done all the public consultation? Whereas in actual fact, we need to just make sure that there's no discrimination. So I think it places a huge burden on these HODs who have to hear all these representations before they make their decisions. But that should at least give comfort to those who think that this bill is going to constrain the autonomy of governing bodies. It'll do no such thing. All it will do is add a certain layer of scrutiny, which is very hard to cross in order to change the admissions policy of a school. Fam, you asked for some SMWX merch and we have delivered. I know you're always looking for ways to help support and grow this channel. So why don't you buy yourself an SMWX hoodie? Super comfy, super warm, and you can represent SMWX. You can check the link down below for how to buy your SMWX hoodie and help build and grow this channel so we can bring you more interviews, more analysis, and more educational insights. Now let's get back to it. So that at least is one of the key issues, and that I think is why it's been controversial. We can look at other provisions in other episodes, but I wanted to give you an understanding of that key reason because I think that's the key of the controversy over BELA. Now, what have we seen as we move to the future and the political and legal stakes? Well, this has caused a crack in the edifice of the GNU because Minister of Education, Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh, who's come on this channel many times, her party, the Democratic Alliance, does not agree with this bill, as I've just said, and which is now this act. So it's clear that the first policy crack has emerged in the coalition government. And what did we learn? The ANC is much more powerful than the DA. The ANC has completely out-negotiated the DA, in my view, because this was seen as a very serious piece of legislation that the DA opposed, and the ANC basically ignored the DA. And what did they do? They relied on support from other parties, such as the EFF. And so I think in many ways, what we're starting to see is that we have one coalition government when it suits the ANC. But when it suits the ANC, they will depart from that coalition government and find support outside that coalition government when they need to, and play a divide and rule strategy, which is very effective because it keeps the ANC in power. So I think the BELA Bill shows that the ANC knows the DA is not very prepared to walk away from this coalition government, and they can test the limits of DA support. And they have tested those limits, and quite frankly, they've tested them successfully because the DA has largely capitulated up to this point. And I've seen many in DA quarters actually being quite angry about this. First, they thought, well, we didn't get a lot of ministries, which is true. And now they see policies that they are vehemently opposed to being passed. And, well, the ANC knows that the DA is not going to partner with EFF and MK. They've already played their hand. So the ANC knows it can test them, because what's the DA going to do? They're not going to oust the ANC from power and partner with EFF and MK. So the ANC can effectively do largely what they like, or at least have the vast disproportion of power in this arrangement. Kwagube didn't attend the signing ceremony. I wouldn't place too much stock in that. I think it's all just symbolism. She will have to implement the act eventually, and Ramaphosa has made that quite clear. So I think we learned something about the GNU through this process, and that is that the ANC has quite a lot of power in this arrangement. And we saw that right at the beginning when the DA tried to say, yes, but we've got this agreement, we need sufficient consensus, which was actually what the document said. But the ANC just turned around and said, nah, not really. And then the DA was like, oh, okay, well, we're still here anyway. So it's clear that the ANC in some ways has the DA's number in these negotiations. Same thing in Gauteng. The DA said, we want MEC positions. And then the ANC was like, no. And then the DA was like, okay, well, we're still in the GNU, so it's fine. So I think that's going to be a pattern, and we'll see how that plays with the DA constituency. Finally, where would this go? Well, it's clear the DA has already said that they are going to challenge this legally, which I find interesting, because within a government, one of the parties is going to challenge the legislation and the implementation of its own government effectively now. So there will be a challenge. But here's the thing about that challenge. Unless there is some kind of interim order which suspends the legislation, this legislation is in force. Now, Ramaphosa has held off for 3 months on implementing Clause 4 and 5, which is the very clause that I've spoken about, these important clauses. But the fact of the matter is that the school year only starts next year anyway. So he can afford some time. I think he's capitulated early on that, and you know, it shows the unnecessary amount of consultation that this government will do. But the fact is that even a court challenge will not suspend the implementation of this bill unless, and it would be very hard, those who bring that challenge can convince the court there should be an interim order. So suspend the legislation while you wait to make the deeper decision about whether this legislation is constitutional. I think it would be far-fetched to imagine that this will be seen as unconstitutional, at least the provisions around discrimination. And why do I say that? Because this amendment bill literally imports language from constitutional court judgments, which says when the HOD is making a decision about admissions policies, they must consider the Constitution, etc. They must follow these reasonable steps. And then with that guidance from the Constitutional Court, legislators have amended the act and taken the language from the constitutional judgments and put them in the legislation. So it's going to be really difficult to go to the Constitutional Court and say this bill, which has your own language, Constitutional Court, is nonetheless unconstitutional. So yes, there may be a big fight and there may be theatrics, but at the end of the day, I think this bill, which has now become an act, will become law and is an important step forward, although there are some residual concerns about its implementation. So that's a review of the BELA Bill turned Act. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. And make sure you keep it locked on SMWX. Help us get to 150,000 subscribers by the end of this month. And make sure you keep it locked right here. Aye.